This program is made possible in part by the Maryland Arts Council through the State of Maryland and the National Endowment for the Arts and the Howard County Arts Council through a grant from Howard County government.
Hello, I'm Belinda McKeown. Welcome to Hugo Polizzo's The Writing Life, where we're speaking today with the novelist Colm Tóibin. Colm Tóibin was born in Enniscorthy, County Wexford, in the southeast of Ireland in 1955. He studied at University College Dublin and lived in Barcelona from 1975 to 1978, witnessing the dramatic transformations which took place in the wake of Franco's death. When Tóibin returned to Dublin, he became part of a pioneering generation of journalists who did crucial work exposing political and societal injustices in Ireland. He then travelled for a period in Africa and South America and covered the trial of the Argentinian generals. His early books of journalism made evident his powerful intelligence as an observer and a commentator, and his gift as a writer of spare and arresting prose. His novels, short stories, and literary criticism have since demonstrated the depth of that gift, the sharpness of Tóibin's intellect, and his immense capacity as a writer for both compassion and control. Tóibin is the author of 6 novels, the first of which was The South, published in 1990, and of 2 collections of short stories, as well as several books of journalism and criticism. His fiction has dealt vividly in themes of exile and artistry, of national and personal mythologies, of political oppression, of human suffering and human loss. He has portrayed 1950s Catalonia, Argentina in a time of fear, the ravages of AIDS, the last years of Henry James, the homesickness and liberation of the emigrant, the watchfulness and gullibility of the Irish. Always his prose interrogates experience, refuses sentiment, and strikes through to truth. His novels have received honours including the International Impact Award, the LA Times Book Prize, both of which were won by his 2004 novel The Master, and the 2009 Costa Novel Award for his most recent novel, Brooklyn. His second collection of short stories, The Empty Family, was published earlier this year by Scribner. Colm Tóibin is currently Leonard Milberg Lecturer in Irish Letters at Princeton University and divides his time between Ireland and the United States. Colm, that business of dividing your time between 2 countries or between a number of countries, at the moment you live between Ireland and the United States, and you do spend summers still in Catalonia. What impact does that have, if any, on the writing? I mean, there's the idea that you have to be in the room by yourself to actually produce the work. But when you're travelling and when you're living between places or dividing your time between countries, how does it influence the writing itself?
I think it's very nourishing in some ways. It's good for short stories in that business of moving up and of uprooting yourself can give you images or can lift images out of you much easier than if you're at home all day in the same landscape observing it, which maybe can lend itself to novels much better, that long-term business of working on something. But it could also lend itself, I think, to a sort of lassitude or silence if you stayed home, or if I did, where I wouldn't get anything from that very much other than an opportunity to work. It wouldn't nourish me imaginatively in that funny way of getting on and off a train does, or looking out the window as I speed by somewhere, which actually does energize me.
Do you take notes? Do you use a notebook? I mean, again, travelling so much or being on the road or on a train, do the images stay with you or do you need to note them down?
I never take notes, ever. If something isn't memorable, then it's no use. And there's also something about taking a note. It's a way almost of keeping it outside yourself. It's that business of what stays in, of something that shifts in you. You could call it an idea if you wanted to, but it's often the development of an idea, of something you didn't know that you could do, and then at that second, as you move, or something moves, you realise, oh, I know. And if you need to write it down, it's no use to you. It has to almost fester in the mind, or indeed get nourished in the mind. But once it would be down as a note, then it would mean, oh, I must forget that really soon. It's forgettable.
You've kind of frozen it in a way, haven't you?
Yeah.
And of course then you pack the notebooks away. I mean, unless you're
Oh,
going
you
to
never
them.
look at the, yeah, you'd think, oh great, I've got to look at this next year. You can't find it when you need it.
And if you have to hunt it out, then that's a different business, isn't it? Hunting for the notebook rather
Yeah,
than...
I mean, I do have the opening at the moment, say, of 3 stories, but I know exactly where they are and I've written them out. And it's not a note, it's the actual opening. One is on a computer and the other 2 are in longhand. But they're not notes, they're very much every sentence as I hope they will be at the end.
The title story of your new collection, The Empty Family, is very much preoccupied with the idea of home. In fact, the character in that story tells himself, or tells us, or tells the person to whom he's speaking several times what home is and what home is not. And I think the final definition or understanding of home he comes up with in the course of the story is that home is where my dead lie in Enniscorthy. It is a preoccupation that your characters have had throughout your work. I mean, going right back to Catherine in the South, who left Ireland for Spain, but came back in a way, and the idea of what home is has always really preoccupied your characters, hasn't it?
Yeah, I think it has mattered a lot because Enniscorthy only got 6,000 people. I mean, we thought it was a big town, but in retrospect, it turns out not to have been. And 3 of my grandparents were born in the town, so I mean my roots go back that far in the town, and my family, a lot of them were teachers, so we sort of know everyone in the town. And therefore losing the town and realising at a certain age that I wouldn't really be living here all my life as everybody else was going to, and as many of my school contemporaries did and many of my siblings did, just stay on in the town and know everyone and, you know, be greeted regularly by exactly the same people and have places you go, that I wouldn't have that in my life, that there was something in me that would resist that. I knew that by the age of 15, and I knew I was going to lose it. And there was sort of gratitude involved. I mean, I was pleased to be away from it. But then the pull of it came, and came very unexpectedly in various ways, and the pull particularly of the landscape, but also of the streetscapes of the town. So all of that pull over losing somewhere, knowing it would never really be yours again, and then attempting to regain it, and realising that, of course, whatever had happened meant you couldn't.
I mean, the places that you go back to in the fiction in Enniscorthy are very particular. I suppose some of them are imagined as well, but thinking of, you know, a grocery store or a drapery or a chipper even, or the streets themselves.
Very, very few of them imagined. There are some imagined, but the atmosphere in them is real. And I mean, you could more or less piece the town together if it fell apart from my books, but it is, I suppose, yeah, it's made up. And sometimes I love, almost for luck, putting a real name in of a shop or of someone who worked in a shop, of just putting that in just so you anchor the book in something that was once true. And that matters as well.
But that brings up the idea of the novelist as a sort of chronicler, which is something, for example, that John McGahern, who often, I should say, set his fictions in the same territory, in the Midlands and the Northwest. He resisted that idea of being a chronicler, that it's not the novelist's duty. There's so much more, the transformation of material that must take place. Would you see this idea of naming places and naming names and putting in Wexford or Enniscorthy surnames and Enniscorthy street names and shop names as a kind of chronicling, or as some other kind of mischief or magic?
No, it wouldn't be there to chronicle. That in other words, that idea of chronicling, even chronicling a political period, or even a phenomenon in society or in culture, wouldn't really interest me. I would use that as backdrop more than anything else. But the idea of putting a real name in would be almost a piece of magic, almost adding just one tiny thing, not to chronicle that, but almost to add an emotional charge to what's around it that would satisfy me. But it wouldn't really matter if you did it or not. But when you do it, there's a lovely little feeling of mischief. Oh, look, I'm adding something true here. And it makes you feel, oh, right, so all around it, maybe I'll make it true too. But I mean true to some idea of truth being true to the characters, being true to the initial imaginative impulse, rather than, say, true to the time or true to the any particular ideology or set of circumstances.
Enniscorthy was there in your first 2 novels, more in the Heather Blazing, obviously, or at least that part of Wexford was. In the south, it's the place from which your character departs. The Heather Blazing was a novel in which you took your character, Eamon, back to that part of Wexford. We saw him there for quite a large part of the novel, and the seascape and the cliffscape becomes familiar to readers of your fiction as the work progresses, as we come across more and more novels and short stories. I'm wondering why, if you could think about why it was that it was in the second novel that you brought the character back there, and in the first novel it was very important for her to escape, and to another time as well, to the 50s.
I think I can tell you that very precisely, that I came towards the end of my first novel, The South, and I needed a new chapter. And I asked a painter one time, how do you paint? And he said, well, you just make a mark first and then you work. So I thought, I'll make some words down, something, anything. And I wrote the sea, a grey shine on the sea. And I had brought them back without intending to that small stretch of coastline on the Wexford coast. And once I did, I found it very satisfying. I found I could work with it. I knew what the mist coming in the evening was like, the horizon was like, the sand, the stones, the dunes, the cliff. I knew what all that was like, and I could work with it. In other words, it gave me an extra emotion that then I could add to the rhythms or to the characters or to what was going on. And I was very surprised by it because it wasn't where I intended the book to go. I wanted them back in Ireland somewhere. There's a missing chapter from the book where I have them in Galway. And it doesn't work. I left it out of the book eventually because I didn't have that emotional connection with Galway in the west of Ireland. So that wasn't there. And so when that was all done, I realised that landscape, that stretch, 2 miles of the coast, of some cliffs, some dunes, a few lanes, a few houses, that really mattered to me. I learned that by accident from the first book, from that chapter in the first book. And then I decided I would go with it, that I would actually follow it to see where it would lead into the sort of novel that I would have deplored a decade earlier, about Irish childhood, Irish conservatism, rural Irish life, in which nothing much happens, and that I would simply trust it enough to write it and hope that maybe somebody would read it. I was very surprised when more than a few read it, because I thought I'd really brought things so far down in terms of, say, lack of colour, that I would lose everybody, except maybe 3 or 4 people from the town.
That's the novel in which the spareness of your prose that I mentioned earlier, really, you see how it's really going to come into its own and how much in control you are of that sense of spareness and stripped down beauty. I mean...
Yes, I suppose part of that was I put a lot of thought into it, realising that if I continue trying to write glamorous novels about European places, that I will betray something, I will give in too much to some impulse to be successful, and that I need to do something pure. I had a job, I didn't need the money, so I thought I need to do something very, very pure.
It's also very pure in that it's the novel in which you dealt with your family's inheritance in political terms. The fact that you came, your Fenian grandfather, your father and granduncle who were members of Fianna Fáil, the involvement of the family in that branch of politics and how central that was to your family's history and mythology. Something again that in the second book you were ready. I would argue to face up to that.
I put it all in, and I love that idea. By the end of it, I thought, well, I have nothing left now, and I also put a lot of my own childhood in, and merged it with my father's childhood. So by setting it in that space between the time when he was growing up and the time I was growing up, I could actually put things in that I knew really well, like serving Mass in the cathedral, which I don't think he had done. But I could give that to the character who was him. And so I was playing a lot with that idea of a father and a son actually making them into one. And that happens in the book.
And that idea of the character being a composite of so many things is central to how you create a character, isn't it?
Yes, I suppose that sometimes when you need a detail, you go to the richest detail you can remember, something that you can summon up really easily, and you hand it over to someone who clearly isn't you, and see then if that paragraph reads right, for them, but working an awful lot from memory. And there were things in the book that were very private, and that maybe people in my own family, like I was in the cathedral with my father when he had heart. I mean, I don't quite know what it was, but he certainly had to be brought out, and I was then didn't know where to go. You know, I mean, some of those things actually happened, and I was summoning them up, thinking, "Oh God, am I going to really write about this that I would have even forgotten about?" And add it into, you know, put it into the ingredients. But also, then there were things completely imagined, like there was the character makes a speech, a dreadful speech from the back of a truck at the time of a Fianna Fáil rally in the town. He's a little creep, really, and I made that up.
You had to imagine a Fianna Fáil creep?
I had to imagine someone, what the speech would say and things, and what the hecklers would shout and all that. That isn't actually out of life.
It's fairly true to life, though. Speaking of the personal, I mean, your next two novels were the novels in which you portrayed homosexual love so powerfully, and they were novels which were very important for many people, I know, because of the honesty and the bravery of those portrayals. Again, was it that you were ready at that stage to address that aspect of experience?
It was also that I had been starting to go to London a good bit, and I had an editor in London, and we were talking about things I might do, and she said, you know, you will have to write about being gay at some point. It won't, you know, don't think that you've written two novels in which it isn't there. It will have to emerge at some point. You'll have to not confront it, but actually use it, exploit it, you know, take it and work with it, see where it will take you. And I remember that night I had two ideas for novels, and one of them is actually is a story called The New Spain, which is in the book The Empty Family, after all these years. And this was, you know, this was sometime in the early 90s, and the other one was The Story of the Night. And I remember her saying passionately to me, "Please write the Argentine book, you know, please write that book."
It was a book
and then I did, and what was curious and something I didn't know, I got a letter. I mean, I got quite a lot of letters, but I got a letter from someone who had been a very powerful figure in Irish public life and could have done a lot for gay people if he'd wanted to, saying that he just didn't know until he read that book that gay people could be in love in the same way as straight people. He thought it was a physical thing, that you just wanted to do things with another guy, but you didn't know that you could be by a telephone wondering if that guy would call, or all those things that are out of the movies. He just didn't know the concept was new to him. And I thought, wow, you know, I mean, maybe the book did. I mean, for once, although the book wasn't written for that purpose, I thought actually creating these images is actually really important, although I didn't set out to make it important. But nonetheless, there it is.
Well, there's a sense in which, if they're true, they will have their effect. You know, if there's a truth to the language and the imagery, then it will do its work in an unforced way. I mean, that brings us to the question of the level to which you consider yourself to be engaged with public life or with political issues. I mean, as an Irish novelist who's also a very important cultural commentator. I mean, for example, you wrote in the Guardian newspaper late last year, after the IMF were called into Ireland, you wrote a very powerful opinion piece about what this meant for Ireland and about the emptiness of some of the rhetoric of sovereignty and patriotism that was being thrown around at the time. Are you able to divide your work as a cultural commentator from your work as a writer of fiction and theatre, or are you happy to allow your engagement with public life to influence the fiction writing in what way it will and it needs to?
In a way, part of the pleasure of the journalism or the use of it is that it gets that part of you out of you, that therefore you've said it and you don't need to say it. So I don't need to write a novel now about the IMF guys coming into Dublin. I mean, there's a lot of pressure on novelists, as you must know, to write a big public novel about what's been going on in Ireland. You know, to follow Tom Wolfe with Bonfire of the Vanities, or one of those big books describing the last 20 years in Ireland. And I think all of us have to really resist this, to say, actually, I'll write essays if you want them. I'll write attacks on well-known people. I'll write, but when it comes to a novel, I need to move into a very, very pure space. That's almost a white space. And if I want to include public life in it, I will do so because it will fit into the fabric of the book. But what I'm really interested in is something else, is a sort of poetry within the rhythm, is a character, is a psychology, is a portrait of a psychology. And if it needs this, I will bring it in the same way if I needed to find out, say, what someone's job was. Say if someone worked in a Intel factory or in a computer factory, I would have to find out what exactly they did. In other words, novels need things, and you often need like public life, or you need a job, or you need an activity in a novel, just to hold it together in some way. But that's not the point of the novel. It's merely a way of it's completely secondary in a novel.
But conversely then, writing about a historical figure like Henry James, is that a completely different process? I mean, you
No.
must immerse yourself in biography, I should say, in order to encounter
Yes,
and create.
but you've found a rhythm in the opening, and your job is to follow that. And every so often you go looking for information, and it's merely information, to see if there's any image in his life that might now strike you, and you can now start working with. But it's not a different space than inventing a character. It really isn't, because all the time you're making sure the sound of the sentences and the way they're flowing, and also the character you've made, who of course isn't Henry James, in the sense that if he had read that book, he would not have recognized himself. I understand he was much funnier when you met him than he is in my book, but I couldn't make him funny because he would have been too comic. It was sort of an artistic problem there. But it was the pure space, and you're going out a bit more often, perhaps, from the pure space into looking for information, looking for an image, looking for a fact even sometimes, and then coming back in with it and stitching it back into the space, almost as though you were a portrait painter and you needed to look at the face in order to get the texture further, deepen the texture. But you could equally paint in the same way if you're painting landscape.
In the Empty Family, Henry James comes back briefly in the story Silence, as does Lady Gregory, whom you've written about in your theatre and in journalism or non-fiction. James in particular, I'm interested in whether since you published The Master in 2004, whether he, as a figure who's important to you in terms of his literature, has that importance deepened and changed for you over the years since you finished the novel?
Yes, it has. I mean, I think I admire him more than I did. One of the things that happened was that people presumed I was an expert on the question, which I wasn't, and asked me to write reviews and essays and introductions to books. And so I set about doing all these things because I was interested. And I got a book. I mean, there's a book out of this called All a Novelist Needs, which are those pieces, but I've even written some more, even more recently. So I'm always going back to one of the novels, rereading it, writing an introduction to it, and seeing it anew. And I'm terribly interested in both him still, and admire him enormously. And then in something he did in the novel, I find so useful that idea of A, keeping it pure, but B, that narrator business of the third person intimate, allowing everything to be seen through the eyes of one person only. So the reader slowly begins to see the world through those same eyes. And he really did perfect this. And I find him constantly intriguing, and I'm not sure I know enough about him at all.
You mentioned the idea that you were expected to be an expert of sorts about James. What, if anything, should the novelist be an expert on?
Oh, I think the human heart is an interesting thing to be an expert on. In other words, someone complained to me recently about a number of novelists who had written recent books on the novel. And I said, oh, we're idiots. You must remember, we are idiots. Don't look, if you're looking for people to think, there are loads of people who, Jacques Derrida can think, Descartes could think, Zizek can think. A novelist's job is to almost be as stupid as possible, except in the cunning moment where you need to structure something, where you need to be very intelligent indeed. But the rest of the time, you need almost an empty mind, that lovely empty mind where you can let any image in, see where it will take you, follow it along, and then allow an emotional charge, almost as in the way that actors and singers can work, that you're working almost like actors and singers. And we do require actors and singers not to have a PhD, in anything, merely to have an instinct which is trained. And the more instinct you have as a novelist and the less intelligence, the better. But however, there are certain times where the intelligence must be used to know what to leave out, to structure it. And it might not be even intelligence, but more tact, almost like social tact, knowing at a certain point when it's necessary to shut up or go to bed or, be nice to somebody. That same tact can be very useful if you're a novelist to know at this point now, have that character say nothing more for a while.
And it goes back to what you're saying about the pressure to write about the country that you come from or the society that you come from. I mean, speaking of ideas of intelligence and of knowing what to say and knowing how to think, you've spoken in your cultural commentary about the need for serious-minded and skillful people in Ireland now. And where are those people going to come from?
Oh, I don't think they're going to come now. Look, I was in Spain in 1975, and I saw the emergence of figures, on one hand, like Felipe González, who had a vision of a society he was going to create. And you can see even in the current Prime Minister Zapatero, someone with a serious social vision. And even on the conservative side, you have to give them some credit. And in the position, say, of the King of Spain, who risked so much for his country. And all of them working on a blueprint for, what has really been a great creation, which is modern Spain.
But Ireland?
And I don't see that possible in Ireland. I don't see a glimmer of it coming from anywhere. So, no. It just isn't there, and it isn't going to be there.
So it's the novelist's job to create an alternative Ireland in the face of...
No, we've got to be very, very careful that they can do their worst. And our job is to merely, in a way that light, in other words, their job is to create electricity. Our job is to create moments of glimmer and shimmer and shine, which disappears under certain pressures. That it may end up being more important and more memorable for people, what writers do. But nonetheless, a poem by Seamus Heaney is not a piece of reforming legislation. It does not set up creches or education systems. It is merely there on the page as a glittering presence. But it's their job to do the other thing. It's our job to live in the shadows, in a way, and moving out of the shadows, see what we can do. But their job is to live in the actual substance. And I'm afraid there's no sign that they know how to do this.
Thank you, Colm, for speaking with us today.
Thank you very much, Belinda.
You've been watching Hoko Politzo's The Writing Life with Colm Tóibin. Thank you for joining us.